So hi, everybody. Hopefully everyone who's joining us is able to see us and toggle your screen so that you can put your gallery view on and say hello to the wonderful students that make up the Student Experience Research Team. It's a project dear to my heart, and I hope that you'll hear from the students. I know that you'll hear from the students today about what the impact this program has had on themselves as students, and then how they believe it's impacted students at Ryerson University. So to get started, there we go. So I want to make sure I acknowledge last year's team too. So this year was the second year we had this program running at Ryerson University. It was started by myself and John Hanna, who is now at University of Toronto. So it's an interesting cross-university initiative a little bit, potentially for the future. And he actually started that in March when everything changed for Ryerson students, for U of T students, for all students across Canada as we work through this pandemic. Some interesting stories to be shared there about shifting research in a crisis. So on the left-hand column there, we have our very first team that launched Sert, and so that team set the path in a lot of ways and set the tone for what this team today will talk to you about. And we also do have one student from Sert 1.0, MK, who's also joined us today to talk about their experience too. So these are the wonderful folks that have made up Sert in the past 2 years. So we are focusing our presentation today on the experience the students have had as part of leading this project. And so we really wanted to give our colleagues across Canada and CACUSS an idea of how to do this type of a research program. And so each of the six students, a couple of them actually aren't able to be there with us today, you'll see on the list, but you'll hear from this year's team about what they've learned by leading a research project in a student affairs context and how arts-based methods of research impacted them, for example. And we will share some of our kind of actual data from our studies, but we really wanted to, again, give you insight into how this program has impacted the students who actually lead it and are participants in it. And of course, they can also speak to how it's been received in the student community at Ryerson as well. So I'm just gonna pass it off to John to talk a little bit about building Sert as a program. And if I didn't mention before, and I haven't been able to look at the chat yet, but you can, of course, drop questions into the chat. It's possible that we're gonna address them throughout the presentation, and we hope to have a chance for questions at the end, but we do have some students in there ready to moderate as needed. So John?
Yeah, thanks, Tessney. Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming today, and also thanks to Allison and all the folks at CACUSS for making this shift to this new format for all of us and away from the conference. I know that must be a ton of work, and so we're all really appreciative of that. I am in the challenging situation of having to restrain myself a little bit from gushing at length about this program, which is arguably among the most meaningful of my career so far. But really, as Tessney says, today is really about hearing from the students who participated in this program. So I'm just going to limit myself to a few comments just to set the context a little bit, hoping that that's a useful way to start. So Sert was motivated, at the risk of oversimplifying what was really kind of a meandering and complex process. It was motivated by fundamentally by a recognition of some gaps, and this was kind of our humble attempt to address some of those gaps. So firstly, and I think most importantly, there was a gap of undergraduate research experiences in a student affairs context. So I think we've all become pretty familiar with the myriad benefits of a meaningful undergraduate experience doing research, you know, a so-called high impact practice. And this has become more and more common inside academic divisions and in classrooms and in labs, but it is still relatively rare in a student affairs context. Secondly, while the field of student affairs is, you know, as we all know, it's subject to pretty substantial scholarship, it is still, I think, relatively rare to involve students directly in the design and development of that scholarship as principal investigators themselves. Thirdly, it's also true that student affairs scholarship is, you know, characterized, I would say, by traditional modes of inquiry, rightly so, of course. There's no judgment when I say that. There's the usual sorts of quantitative assessments that try to link causally, make a connection between intervention X and student success measure Y. More commonly, we're familiar with traditional qualitative sorts of analyses and narrative analyses, and of course the usual sharing of best practices. All of that is really good, but I think it's relatively rare to find non-traditional approaches to research and inquiry applied in this context. And finally, I think there was something interesting about offering a research experience where we build a team of researchers, not for extra credit or for you know, acquiring an experiential learning credential, although all of that is very good, obviously. It is rarer to engage students in this kind of thing and give them a good, solid wage for doing so. So that changes the dynamics in interesting ways that I think is worthy of talking about a little bit. So anyways, our efforts at building this, like I said, were just a sort of our modest attempt at addressing some of those gaps. And so it was motivated and driven by these 4 commitments you see on the screen: creating this meaningful high impact practice for students, trying to, through that process, make some sort of meaningful contribution to student affairs scholarship, trying to activate some non-traditional, in this case, primarily arts-based approaches to inquiry in our methodology, and then supporting these students financially through this process. So, like I said, very simple kind of background and context to what was much more complex as a start. And that's a little bit about the why of this program. The how and the what we learned is a much deeper story that I think the students will regale you with a little bit now. So I will pass the floor on to them, and through the course of this session, they will reveal, hopefully, not only some of the things they learned about student experience, but how this program had some value for them. So with that, I will happily pass the floor over to the students.
Great. Just before MK joins in to talk about the first Sert project and this kind of metaphor that took hold as an actual method, we just wanted to throw this slide up there to give you kind of the overview of the 2 studies that we've done, these 2 projects, in terms of a little bit of some ideas of what came out of the projects and the types of engagements we've had with student participants. And just a note, if it's of interest to anyone, both projects went through the Research Ethics Board protocol here at Ryerson. So that's also a big kind of learning experience for the students who are involved in that. If you can imagine doing that in your undergrad, it's quite a rigorous process, and I think that they learn a lot out of that as well. So this is just kind of the high-level summary. And we have two full reports that have been published that detail all the method that went into this. And in our writing and the way we talk about our work, we always center the process as like it cannot be untied. It's connected very deeply to the way we get to our results, the process of building the research projects themselves. So I'm going to pass it over to MK.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm MK, and I was originally hired for Sert 1.0. So in speaking about like boat number 2 and the process of things, boat number 2 was what started off as like an icebreaker amongst you know, a new team of people, slowly became our guide and our method of inquiry. So on our first day, John asked our team to imagine a hassle-free sort of ocean-going travel opportunity where when we arrive at the harbor, we will be tasked to choose between 2 boats. Goal number 1, a route and the satisfaction and comfort were of, you know, top priority. But boat number 2 made no promise of this at all. So uncertainty, no itinerary, and no guarantee of comfort or predictability is kind of what centered that experience. The majority of the team did choose boat number 2. We had one person who chose boat number 1, but like we slowly kind of like were able to pull them onto boat number 2. But so what started as to get to know each other and get to know co-researchers within their practice and within their ways of thinking. So like eventually became our method of inquiry. And what I found in this experience is that it supports boat number 2 as a method of inquiry, supports non-traditional ways of thinking and generating knowledge and understanding. I felt as if though that there was a room for more creative/arts-based forms of thinking within our practice. And this was sort of evident in the exercises and the challenges that we would routinely sort of go through as a way to sort of stimulate, you know, our ways of thinking about our research and what we were curious and contemplating of. We found that, or I found that boat number 2 supported the Sert initiative by making the world of research accessible to students from different programs and backgrounds. So for myself, I feel as if though I experienced less anxiety and more confidence around my capabilities within regards to research, but I also expanded my perceptions of what and how a researcher could do and what. So it was a pivotal sort of turning point and learning opportunity for myself. This method of inquiry also facilitated collaboration between co-researchers. So what felt really good was the fact that there was a team, and that in this team that there was a circulation of ideas shared amongst and between each other. And that felt good. I felt as if though through that there was like the space to uncover and explore themes within our own experience as researchers, as students, and as everything else that comes with being. And lastly, the end of this experience, I felt as if those students there was a deepened understanding of what it meant to explore, a more conscious understanding too. But also when it comes to questioning and complicating macro and micro issues, there was an understanding of what that could look like in a way that didn't replicate like harmful practices of what we historically known research to be. So yeah, that's boat number 2, and it was definitely more than just a metaphor. So I think moving on to our next slide. Here is basically the first Sert project, or visuals of like what guided like our first project. So collage inquiry was a method that we used to explore the student experience. The first Sert project built the foundations for this year, for the second team in many ways, but both research projects are different. So in Sert 1.0, the Stuck narrative project investigated questions about Ryerson students' sense of belonging in a university institution, and the ways in which dominant narratives about the post-secondary experience impacted students' actual lived experience within it. Our research question was, to what extent do students experience a sense of dissonance between the stereotypical representation of the university experience and their actual experience of it? So the method that we used, our method was for participants to create 2 collages each, one in response to the question, what did you envision coming into post-secondary education? And the second in response to, what is your actual lived experience as a Ryerson student, as a university student? And our participants used their collages to share their stories, and we later analyzed them using narrative inquiry. So in our results, we found that students do experience a dissonance between their expectations and the reality of post-secondary, and that the ways in which they describe the impact of that dissonance reinforces the grit narrative often repeated about university. It's tough, but you overcome and emerge transformed on the other side. We also learned how effective and beautiful collage making as a form of eliciting stories can be. So yeah, that was Sert 1.0. And here is the artwork and the results and the findings of what the experiences were like for participants. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, MK. So throughout the presentation, you'll also probably notice drawings like these. And so I just wanted to make note that all of this work came from the students, and that's part of our method. And so what we do in our Sert meetings, our Sert sessions that we call them, we draw as a way to think about what we know and think about our ideas. And so we're just sharing that with you in our presentation today. So these are some of the first drawings that we did as a team this year, when we knew we came together and the team had a really strong sense from the beginning that they wanted to investigate this idea of student engagement and what it meant for Ryerson students and for themselves, and they always bring themselves to that work. And so these are some of those first interpretive drawings when prompted with draw the student experience or draw student engagement. So now we'll go to Claire, who's going to speak a bit about this this year's project, kind of what you see here, our research questions, and a little bit about our method before we jump to the kind of real deep lessons we've learned from this project.
Hi guys. So yeah, we wanted to focus our research around engagement because that's what our group meetings always went back to. Like, we found that just in talking with one another, when we brought up like, well, what is it that makes a student take a chance on engagement opportunities on campus? Like, what is the difference between a student who feels connected to the university and a student who feels like there's kind of a disconnect? And so for that really brought up a lot of feelings just among our own team. And we found that it really struck a chord with us personally. So we decided we were going to focus our research on trying to hear from students and understand their stories, and try and illuminate something a little bit deeper about the student experience that maybe we haven't seen before. So we started by sending out a survey we wanted to see what some students' perceptions about the concept of student engagement is. We wanted to know if there was a relationship between student sense of academic desirability and the degree to which they feel they can engage at Ryerson. So we sent out a survey for students to fill out just by using campus labs. And then that sort of led us to creating this like huge telephone booth, which I remember like getting the materials together for that booth. Like we had to get this like 8 foot by 8 foot cardboard box and like build it in a way that like it looked like a little telephone booth that students might look at and feel like excited about, and maybe it would draw them closer to what we were investigating. We kind of just wanted to make a spectacle, so we came up with an original Sert design. Gillian had a huge part in like creating graphics for it. And then we schlepped this giant like telephone booth all over campus doing these activations and getting students to come talk to us, fill out our survey, and record some of their responses to our research questions in this makeshift telephone booth. So yeah, it was quite the experience. From there, we sort of shifted our research. We initially had this idea we wanted to do a walking interview through campus where students would guide us to places on campus that are significant to them. Obviously that didn't happen because there was this global pandemic, but we sort of were able to make the most of it, and then we ended up doing these like online virtual interviews. And one of the unintended benefits of being able to still connect with students in that platform is that we actually captured some of students' like very first responses to having to the school shutdown and having to find a way to be engaged when all of the processes have completely transferred to online. So that was definitely interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic now to like, we're gonna switch over the slide and I'll hand it over.
Thanks, Claire, that's great. So this is another example of a drawing. And as Claire was talking about, so this was this kind of idea of academic desirability. It was this theory we were working with. And so this is, for example, an example of Gillian's, a drawing on the left of what she's been told student engagement is. And the way she described it was a hand in every bucket and feet too, and having to spread yourself thin. And then what she actually thinks it is. And it's a bit more about community, I think, is what that drawing is meant to evoke there. And then this idea of academic desirability was, we were trying to understand or bring another idea to the table about belonging and what helps students or hinders them from seeking engagement opportunities. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Daniel.
All right, hello everyone. So Claire already spoke a little bit about how our research method was brought to life. And so I'm going to explain about how it really challenged my understanding of what research was. And I think it's true for a lot of undergraduates, because coming into Sert, I had very narrow preconceptions surrounding research. In my own undergrad, when I'm writing a research report, you're connected to research in a way of consumption. You consume 10 to 15 reports and you crib some lines from them. You learn maybe a little bit from it, but at the most, very little of it lodges in your brain. You don't really consider the impact of, say, one study over another. So coming into Sert, as I was warming up and considering the intricacies of what goes into producing a research report, I realized I had very little idea about the process at all, and even less so about arts-based research, Eisner and Barone and the forebears of that. And I mean, in my imagination, research production was like walled off to individuals who are higher level in their field with advanced degrees and like just the peak of the mountain in terms of expertise. So it was illuminating to sort of flip the coin and be on the other side of the barrier between research and researched upon. And I think Sert, I mean, does their best to try and cross that barrier and try to break it down as well. Like on the off chance you would come across a survey email from any student organization. You know, I would open it, and if I complete it, probably very likely never hear it again. You know, it's done in a sort of way that's not really presented back to students, and you don't really see the effects take action. And CERT sort of represents an alternative to that sort of dominant conception of research gathering. Being that we are students, interviewing students and gaining, when we have proximity to student life, we're bringing in, we already have some experience with the nuances of student culture and the topics that are like important and relevant to student life. Some of us already had community on campus, but what came out as we were debriefing was that many of us created community of our own with each other through the process as well. And there's other facets of it that wouldn't be commonly accepted in wider university structures, such as, you know, an inherent skepticism towards the dominant themes, where others might say, you know, this thing is this way for this reason, and that's the way it is. CERT approaches with a sense of questioning rather than a sense of conclusivity. And the arts-based research sort of acts like a hook for students for all that. It presents everything we learn in a more relatable format, I find, than a tome of research. As I mentioned before, the way research is commonly written is certainly valuable to students, and it might be urgent, but it doesn't really hook students. It's not as accessible to search out to find a 40-page research report, rather than, like Claire mentioned, our booth, how we collected data. And I mean, understanding that is what really went into our data collection and our survey and our booth in general. It wasn't just as simple as an email campaign. We spent so many months like developing the questions and keeping that arts-based ethos with us at the forefront of the SARB, the survey audio recording booth, is what we called it. We actively sort of sought a creative way to bring the research to students in the form of that telephone booth, as Claire called it. I prefer to think of it as a portal, because it really just pops up in the middle of these university campus spaces, and it looks very DIY, and it sticks out, it really stands out. And this telephone booth where they could record their thoughts surrounding student engagement, we kept that up with our interviews as well. As our conversations guided us to think about the space that students are occupying, we channeled that into our method. Rather than inviting students into like a lab room to have a face-to-face sit-down interview, we attempted the walking interviews, with the intention that we would be speaking to students in spaces they know and spaces they occupy regularly. So we really prioritize that sort of wider, multitudinous understanding of student engagement, having a range of definitions of student engagement, and really understanding that there's no singular model of student engagement. And you can see that in our continuum of student definitions on our website. And MJ is going to speak more to the idea about the community aspect of it.
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I'm going to be speaking about another way I think that CERT is able to challenge what research is, and this is really a thing that impacted me quite profoundly. So the CERT experience began with open conversation. So we weren't just talking about research and student affairs, but we really got into each other's lives, the work we were doing outside of CERT, the things we like to do for fun, food we like to eat, anything was on the table. And there was really intentional space built into every meeting, every week, to build community, to grow to trust each other. And this continued through the entirety of the experience. We made space for tangents, sometimes looping back to ideas that had been dropped weeks earlier. And sometimes these conversations lasted half an hour during a meeting. It wasn't ever about getting right to work in the traditional sense. And this was uncomfortable at first. I've never worked in a place where intentional space was made for community building. And we all live in a system that's very focused on efficiency, speed, and results. And this was the exact opposite. This was an intentionally slow process focused most on communication and idea building. Totally different than anything I was used to. And I'm sure everyone else on the team could say that as well. But this is essential to CERT. You can't build community overnight. And if we had leaped right to deciding a topic, we definitely wouldn't have gotten to speak about the issues that we did, the things that Claire already spoke on, with such depth and creativity and with such trust in one another to be able to experiment and make mistakes. What happened was the topic, the methodology, and everything about our research emerged from the group as a whole. what we produced is a work of profound collaboration, and one that taught me not only about the potential for research to be relational, but also it was a powerful model of what is possible as a team and as a community. Early on, we discussed a metaphor of murmuration to kind of describe the ideal in group processes. And if you're not familiar with what that is, you should definitely look it up. It's essentially how a kind of bird called a starling, they are known to fly in these massive, intricate patterns in the sky, but with no one leader or any apparent hierarchy to determine how this pattern works. It's essentially like an emergent art design by birds, and is really, you need to look it up. And it is exactly kind of what this team aimed for. We tried to make an emergent process possible as a team. Getting to this point of murmurating research really slowed us down greatly. And it may not work for every project, obviously. Lots of projects need to be focused on results before community. But this slowness is key to Sert's work and key to our purpose and in building the strong relationships that we all now have as a team. Relationships were also the core of how we structured the methodology of the research itself. Our goal in doing interviews was to create an open and flowing conversation between us and the participants. So we had specific questions that we wanted to work towards answering that you saw on the other slide. We weren't pressured. We weren't meant to feel pressured to ask them in any particular order, nor to have to package the students' responses into results that would purport to determine any facts about their lives. Instead, we just simply wanted to listen and share the stories and experiences of being a student at Ryerson. Additionally, we constructed our method around walking on campus rather than how research is traditionally constructed, which would be on either side of a desk with me with a clipboard and the participants sitting away from me and answering my questions. We were curious what kind of responses what kind of conversation would emerge as we moved through the spaces that were important to students, where they worked and ate and spent their downtime. And we also felt that potentially walking side by side would destabilize the hierarchy of researcher and researched, and really get to deeper and fuller stories of students' lives. And as we said before, we're still very curious if that methodology would work because we were not able to use it. Instead, we had to structure our interviews around on Zoom. We basically interviewed students on Zoom and then had them open Google Maps. And then they gave us a virtual tour of the spaces that are important to them, which I think still managed to apply the idea of relational research. For me, it took a lot of work to get to make Google Maps work the way I wanted it to when I was doing my interview with my participant, which actually built rapport and allowed me to kind of show some vulnerability and discomfort with this kind of technology. And that definitely increased her comfort with me. And this benefited the conversation that we had. And so kind of giving us an opportunity to be vulnerable as researchers, as students, and then as students to students was really positive. And additionally, as Claire mentioned, we built intentional space into our research in order to kind of share in the trauma of the pandemic and the quarantine, and to talk about how students were feeling at this particularly unstable time and kind of show some empathy for that. Fundamentally, to kind of conclude my portion, I learned how listening should be at the core of narrative research. We read many times throughout the year the work of a particular theorist named Petra Monroe Henry, and in particular her essay, The Future of Narrative. And that essay challenges narrative researchers to not try and fit stories of who they're researching into existing narrative structures. Instead, to just try and present stories of life as it is, messy and evocative, and as difficult as that is. This personally was a major destabilization of my previous biases about what research is. Before Sert, I saw research as an activity that was locked off from the public and difficult to really create any change in the world. I wasn't sure if it could really be effective in that way, and it could potentially do the opposite. We know stories of the amount of harm that's been caused to communities because of researchers. But in Sert, I saw the power of research to be transformational, both for participants and for researchers. Petra Monroe Henry states that empathetic listening is the core of a research project, a narrative research project specifically, and I think it also is the core of how Sert worked with one another. And I think we unlocked the possibility for research to be a relational activity as well as an academic one in our work. That's about all I have to say. Next up, Claire and Gillian are going to talk about what we learned specifically about student engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, MJ. Hi, everyone. I'm Gillian. We're going to now look at the models we created. It's kind of how we visualized what we learned about student engagement and desirability. On the left, we have our continuum of student engagement. Though student engagement was primarily defined as extracurricular activity in our survey, we noticed when we were coding the open-ended survey responses that there was a vast range of perspectives and many different definitions for student engagement. So we wanted to use a continuum to kind of express how varied students' perspectives were. At the top of our continuum, we have broad understandings of student engagement, such as just the activities of a student. In the middle, we have more of the traditional ideas, such as an active sense of belonging or how well an individual can participate. And at the very bottom of our continuum, we have the more narrow conceptions of student engagement, many of which are critiques that speak to an idea of student engagement that is quite restrictive and superficial in these students' perspectives, such as gimmicky spirit events. What's interesting as we looked at a lot of these responses is that many of the ones kind of mapped in the middle and the more traditional understandings of student engagement underline the necessity of being on campus and having spare time, which means for a lot of people, especially at Ryerson, we're like a commuter school, there are serious barriers to engaging in this form of student engagement as is traditionally understood. And then on the right hand, we have our other model, which is perception of one's desirability. And this is kind of our focus on how desirability, engagement, and belonging connect. We have this kind of virtuous cycle: more desirable leads to more engagement, leads to more belonging. That was articulated by one of our interviewees. It's kind of the more dominant understanding, I suppose, of how these ideas relate. And then on the left, we have this kind of open, broken cycle. We struggled to envision how this cycle would work for quite some time, because we were kind of dead set that the model on the left, the cycle on the left, would be just the mirror image of the virtuous cycle. So it'd be this vicious cycle. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out where the pieces fit. And after a lot of discussion and diving back into all the data and like the stories that we got from both the survey and the interviews, we realized that it isn't this closed circle at all. It's more complex than that. It's more messy than that. Like MJ was talking about that article. You can't really categorize it in this nice little cycle. So we realized that the pursuit of desirability, specifically academic desirability, which is high GPA, academic persistence, etc., this, for a lot of students, meant that they had to sacrifice engagement to pursue that desirability, which then could lead to all sorts of other feelings, like feeling detached from the institution, etc. So we definitely wanted to make sure that these question marks in this open kind of cycle would emphasize, like, yet again, like I said, the messiness of it all, but also the idea that there could potentially be more areas of inquiry to address. There's a lot still to learn. And with this model, we also really wanted to reflect how desirability can be considered an additional complicating layer to the relationship of engagement and belonging. So those are kind of how we visualize what we learned. We definitely have a lot more questions coming out of it than answers. But I think in the Sert method, as we've kind of all discussed, this idea of taking what we've learned and trying to like put it in more of a visual manner was really important to the process. So I think Claire will talk a little bit more about our personal experiences with engagement.
Thanks, Gillian. Okay, so when we first started our research, I was feeling really eager to just learn the results of all the data. I thought that somewhere hidden inside of all the survey responses and the interviews, we'd find a lesson or a moral that might change the way we like view studenthood at Ryerson. But when we began combing through the data and creating a system to carefully code students' survey responses and interviews, it was really hard for me to see anything beyond just a collection of numbers and stats. So to breathe life back into our data and to aid our understanding of the research, we reimagined the info in visuals. We toyed with different web-based designs and models to convey the results, grappling with how to tell students stories in a way that honored their individual differences and complexities. But we settled on a design for our continuum that feels true to Sert, using our own sketches and doodles to reflect our status as not only researchers, but students and peers. So this process allowed us to personalize the study and infuse our unique ideas and creativity into the raw data. So I was never actually able to unearth a singular overarching theme or conclusion from our work. If anything, we have so many more questions about engagement and desirability now than we ever had when we first started. Like, what will engagement look like next fall when first-year students are all entering into their studies remotely? And how does students' access to engagement opportunities intersect with their class or race or gender? In the movie of Sert, the final results would play on the screen as the credits roll. But our story leaves plenty of room for possible sequels and even prequels. With that, I'm gonna pass it back to Tesni.
That's great. Thanks everybody so far. So yeah, we're reaching our conclusion, and I just wanted to put this up here. This is a couple drawings from MJ talking about the potential for what this work could do moving forward. And so I hope that you've gotten a sense of what Sert is from a community perspective, and from the ways we do our work and its impact on the student researchers. So, you know, Sert is kind of like a stepladder and a key for the little dude in MJ's drawing for whom research used to feel really inaccessible. That's definitely one of the dominant feelings that we've been reflecting on as we wrapped up this project. I do want to invite everyone to explore our website, get in touch with us, and let us know you know, answers to the questions that we have. For example, in our recommendations section, we have lots of ideas about what other student researchers might be able to do with this work. And we know that we just skimmed the surface, both in our work and in today and what we shared with you of what we actually learned. And I hope that our focus on the student researchers helped you see the potential for how programs like this and how engaging students in research that can improve our work in student affairs, of course, but that it also has a direct impact on the students who lead the research work itself. So I do want to open it up to questions. If you want to drop it in the chat, you're welcome to do that, or unmute yourself and say hi if you have questions. Anybody? We had a couple of our students not able to make it today, so I just want to honor Sarah and Bilquis also did all the amazing work that you see reflected here. So to my team, I'll ask one of the students. Question was receiving payment a big drive for you participating? So maybe rephrasing that even a little bit to something we've talked about. What might be the difference between this being a paid job versus a class or an extracurricular engagement opportunity? What is there something about it being a job that was impactful for you? Anybody?
I do remember us having this discussion about whether it would be different if this was just for credit. I do think it being paid definitely drove us to participate more, but I don't think that was the biggest drive for participating. I think being paid for it took a lot of the stress out of having to add on what felt like another class or another semester's worth of work or 2 semesters worth of work, but it wasn't the main driver. I think understanding student engagement and realizing that you could actually play a part in it was really what drove me further. Being paid was just a nice add-on, to be honest.
Um, Also, I think I would like to add to that I definitely agree in that being paid was definitely not the driving sort of thing. Well, personally for me, I think a part of student engagement and a part of thinking about the way students um, engage in whatever capacity, whether that be through employment on campus or in class or in their community. I think a lot of it meant a big part of that was just, I guess, honoring like the experience and the knowledge that students can sort of bring to the field of research, and students especially from all backgrounds. I think for myself, the fact that for myself, it was the fact that there could have potentially have been the opportunity for me to shed light onto student experiences that aren't often discussed. And so that was a motivating factor for myself in participating with Sert.
Thanks, MK.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've got a question from Allison. How do we recruit for this past year? So I can flip it maybe to one of this year's team members to remember to talk a little bit about when you saw the job call. You can talk about the interview process if you're interested. We do have a unconventional interview process, but just to answer the first little bit of the question, we post it and we share it on the Ryerson student job boards. It's funded differently than some of the other work study programs, and so it's up to us to kind of post it where we can. We make sure that administrators in the faculties are sending it to where we hope that they answer the call when we send it to them. And I think that's how most of this year's team they got it from profs actually, or their or our partners in the Career Center. But maybe if one of you, I'm going to look at who to call on, wants to talk about the interview process or that kind of what drew you to the application.
The interview process was wild. we had to do something called a marshmallow test, where Tesney and John gave us. First of all, they did a bunch of us had. So it was a 2-part interview process. First, we all had to send in an application, letting them know what kind of research we're interested in pursuing, what we want to investigate about the student experience, and then from there, Tesney and John called a few students back to come in and interview. So it was a group interview, which in and of itself is a little intimidating, but once we arrived, we got divided into groups, and then we were all given like 1 marshmallow and then, I don't know, like 20 sticks of raw spaghetti and a piece of tape and a piece of string, and they're like, okay, we want you to build a structure that supports a marshmallow. And you have like, what was it, like 20-30 minutes to do it? It was wild. And then so we all started to like build this like tiny little contraption out of pasta noodles to try and support this marshmallow, and Tesney and John were just staring at us from their respective corners. We had no idea what we were being tested on. And I'd just like to point out that I was in a group with MJ, and we successfully built a structure that held up the marshmallow. So I would like to think that that's a huge reason why I am here in this conference today.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, it's definitely, it kind of becomes, candidates' introduction to what Sert is like, I would say, the interview process. And to get there is, like Claire was saying, we actually, rather than just asking students to send in a traditional cover letter, we give them a specific set of questions that we're hoping they respond to. And then in general about recruitment, it's typically an upper year program. It's not necessarily first years aren't eligible, but we do like if folks have had maybe a research methods course before, or just are able to articulate after maybe having had at least 1 year of experience at school.
I guess I would only add, it's John here. Yeah, I think Claire described it well. It felt important to Tessney and me to make some sort of early signal to potential applicants that it was going to be a fairly non-traditional, potentially uncomfortable process. And we were actually surprised by the number of, it seemed like an unusually high number of applicants, of really, really strong, exceptionally strong applicants for the job. So that was an interesting start.
Yeah. There's been some questions about the effect of having students research students, and I think that MJ just responded really well, kind of saying students are excited when other students, like it helped many of our participants, I think, participate because they saw us tabling. So part of that was just doing the same thing you see on campus all the time. Hey, do you want to come talk to us? But then we got some really interesting responses when students would say, oh, like, this is really interesting. Why are you doing this? This is a job, really? Like, what? And then that the students themselves as researchers can speak to their own experiences, of course, and just kind of help participants feel more comfortable. And like MJ described in his interview experience, kind of fumbling your way through it, and kind of immediately those potential, walls get down, and you can get to some vulnerable kind of places together. And then the telephone, yeah, it's a great question whether it worked out. Does someone on the team want to talk about the SARB, the survey audio recording booth, and whether you felt it was successful, what you would do differently next time, maybe? I see Daniel unmuted.
Oh, you called me out. Okay. Yeah, so the telephone, how it worked was we collaborated with a student artist named Tristan, who sort of rigged the telephone for us so that when you picked it up, a little recording would play, and then it would record your voice similar to like a voice messaging service. And we recorded them back on an SD card. We had those interviews available to us with their transcriptions, and we were really looking for information that students gave us straight from the voices. Like we said, rather than putting them in a little lab room with our clipboards, we sort of like re-illustrated the feeling of speaking to a family member over the phone, or venting to a friend, and we were really trying to get down to the core of how students actually speak.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. And then just overall, I think more than anything, it helped bring attention to us, because we had this strange thing up in student spaces, and they walked it around campus. Yeah, and it was a really great collaboration with another student on campus who was able to craft this thing for us. And it was a way for students to respond to our open-ended question if they didn't want to type it out. That was kind of the main idea behind it, and then it ended up being more about these kind of activations.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that, because I can't resist? It was, it's hard, I think we'd be hard pressed to say that we would recommend to any other folks out there contemplating, creating an undergraduate research experience, that they should build a DIY telephone booth in this manner. I mean, by all means do that, and feel free to reach out to us. I think it was, for us, an absolutely kind of almost essential part of our process. And some might call into question just the amount of work and time and energy that we've spent, but it was such a great collaboration with another student artist on campus. And in the end, I don't think it was sort of secondary, the degree to which that actually worked for collecting data. I think it did, and I think I would do it again, and it did some interesting things. But what it was really, what became clear was that it was a really good device for us to just work together on something towards this idea of community building, and as a way to be doing something while we are thinking about our project together. And it certainly fit that bill for sure. And there's some pictures of it.
Yeah, I just pulled up some pictures. We have another question. just aware of time. I'm not sure, Allison, if you're going to jump in at some point, but I'll try and get to this one. How has participating in CERT influenced your career options? Great question.
I think for me, just very briefly, I'm planning on pursuing a career, doing a master's of counseling, and this has really solidified for me that I want to do a research project as a part of that and pursue that as an aspect of my future career and how I'm planning on achieving that. That was already on the table, but I think this showed that there is, as I talked about in what I said, like there is potential for transformation even from a person-to-person basis in research, and I didn't have that reality before this experience. So yeah, definitely going to pursue a master's.
Amazing. I know, MK, at one point you did, not to put you too much on the spot, but you had expressed a little bit about how it prepared you for future job opportunities. You're muted still.
Am I heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think it definitely informed the way that I thought about myself as a researcher and just thought about things in general. And so with this experience, it's opened up my, it's, I guess, broadened my skills, I guess you could say, and brought in like the opportunity for more opportunities to explore things that are of interest to me, to capacities that I just didn't really think of myself being involved in. So yeah, and I'm also interested in pursuing a master's, but we'll see.
Great. Thanks for all the great questions, folks.
I just want to end by saying what a great job the students did today. I mean, certainly one of the elements of the experience was to see this through from beginning to end. And as we all know, as you finish a research project, one of the responsibilities is to share the results of that. And so the students have seen it through right to this point. And I think you can see why I was so pleased with this project, and they were really an exceptional group of people, and they've been great company over the last year for sure.